Hello, here's the current state of my desk. These are all the Kmart art supplies that I just reviewed in my previous video. I swatched everything out, but I hadn't actually made any artworks with them. Well, today I'm kind of in the mood to make some art, so I figured I might use some of these things and see what I can come up with. Let's get into it! Starting out with the most difficult supply, the soft pastels, because that's how I roll, I taped down a piece of pastel mat because I wanted to give the pastels a fair chance with a decent surface to work on, rather than paper that won't grip the pastels as well. And I'm drawing an eagle that I found online, just going straight in with the pastel blocks, rather than trying to put down a layer of graphite pencil on that pastel mat, which would destroy the pencil pretty quickly. And I have a confession to make. This is the first artwork I have ever made with soft pastels, and I had no idea what I was doing. I tried to blend the pastels out with some tissue, but of course the pastel mat being rough just shredded it immediately. But I dug around in my stash and found some little makeup sponges, and those worked a lot better. I'm not sure if I'm doing this right, but I was trying to layer up the dark pastels, so adding browns and then black on top of it to create a richness of colour. And I slowly built up the layers on the whole eagle just by adding in areas of shadow, then going over it with the light pastel. That white pastel is probably the one that's going to get used up the quickest at the rate I'm going here. And then I kept blending and adding in more layers. This was actually really fun, and I enjoyed using the pastels a lot more than I expected to. I thought it was going to be a horrible mess and that I wouldn't like the feeling of them, but I found that blending with the sponge was okay, and I didn't have to feel the nasty rough texture on my fingers. And I've also found with using messy materials like charcoal and pastels, it's a really great idea to have a damp rag off to one side so you can wipe your fingers on it periodically and keep them relatively clean. Oh yes, and here on the eye, I was using a paper tortillon to blend the pastel together because it's a lot more detailed, and I could not get that same level of finesse with the makeup sponge. But the sponge worked perfectly for the rest of the eagle. As for the pastels themselves, I have to say I'm really impressed with them. Now, as I've probably mentioned, I am no expert with pastels, but I found these easy to use. They're a bit firmer than super soft pastels, say by companies like Sennelier and Schmincke, which do some amazing ones. But for a set of 24 pastels that cost $4, which is cheaper than one pastel by Schmincke, these are amazing value. They're a soft to medium texture, and some of them were a bit gritty in parts, so it's a little uneven when it comes to laying the pastels down. But it was just a tiny bit, and it wasn't significantly bad that I couldn't use the pastels at all. I have used some really scratchy pastels in the past, and they're awful. And I think that's partly why I never liked using pastels or wanted to use them. But after using these ones, I have changed my mind a bit. This was really fun, and the Anko soft pastels had quite a lot of vibrancy of colour in them. They layered really well on top of each other, and with the blending sponge I was able to then add more layers on top. And I think using a high quality pastel mat really made a big difference as well. This is a Clairefontaine one if I'm not mistaken, and it has a nice grippy tooth on it. It's not too rough but not too smooth either, just the perfect balance. I was able to build up the white quite well, and you could see how opaque they are, just adding layers on layers. I think the eagle looks quite striking on the darker pastel mat. I'm glad I chose that colour too. It's nice against the yellow and the white. I also added in a tiny bit of blue just to get some of the cooler highlights and shadows, and then I went in again with another layer on the bottom of the feathers. Because I'd done so many layers on the top, the lower part needed a bit more, and I didn't want to blend it too much. I did want to have some texture in the feathers. So the last thing I did was add a bit of pastel around the edges of the mat to kind of create a bit of a frame and break up the pastel matte colour. Colouring them directly on there just made it a bit messy, so I scraped some off with a knife and blended it in more like a pan pastel, and that worked amazingly for the background. Look how bright these colours are. They're fantastic. So I'm giving these pastels 10 out of 10, and here's a satisfying peeling of the tape just to give a nice border. I also used some spray fixative later just to make sure that the pastel stays on. Well, I'm all done. I really cannot fault these pastels. Yeah, they're not the most amazing things in the world, but I had a lot of fun with them and I was able to get a half-decent artwork out of it. This turned out actually much better than I was expecting. So, a great success with the pastels. I'm definitely going to have to do more with them because they were surprisingly a lot more fun than I was expecting. Now, my next task is to clean up this desk because I have got pastel dust everywhere and it's just going to smear all over the place. Once I tidied everything up, I'm on to my second piece of artwork, and I'm using the black drawing ink inside my Moon Man fountain pen to add line art on a picture I'd drawn initially in another sketchbook, and then I traced it out onto a piece of paper. I really wanted to try out those skin tone markers, but I wasn't really in the mood to draw a face or figure, so instead I'm drawing a Venetian mask that has steampunk elements to it so that I can colour it in with the marker pens. I don't know where I get these ideas sometimes, they just kind of come to me and I tend to go with the flow. But I had tested out on a separate piece of paper to make sure that the marker pens don't smudge the black ink, and it's perfectly fine because alcohol markers and water-based inks generally don't mix. So the markers went on perfectly well over the top. This fountain pen ink is really great, especially the black. It's nice and dark and it works perfectly in a fountain pen. I have no complaints whatsoever. It's exactly the same as more expensive inks. So now I'm going in with that little set of brush markers. They are brilliant. I really love these pens so much. Honestly, they worked just as well as Copic markers, and I even think I prefer the brush on these better, so I'm sticking with my 10 out of 10 for them. $2 for the pack of 6 markers was an absolute bargain. I really hope they have more in stock. If they do, I will let you know. I do keep checking because I need more of these marker pens. They're gorgeous! I just went in with different shades, starting off with the darkest pen and then working my way up to the lightest ones. I had to go over everything quite a few times just to get some depth of colour in there. I also added in some gold pen at one point on the chain. The mask itself worked out really well. Unfortunately, I decided to add some of the coloured ink to the background and the ink does not work well on this paper. It was okay in the pen, but not to paint it on, so I made a mess of the background. I fixed it up a little bit by adding marker pens on top of the ink, but it's not great. So enjoy the mask and then we shall laugh at the background when that happens. Well, I'm not sure what it's supposed to be in the end. It's like it's floating in a puddle of water, but I do really like these markers. I think they were excellent. The mask itself worked quite well. The background we'll just kind of pretend is not there. And I hope against hope that they bring out more of these brush markers. I will be keeping an eye out for them and snapping them up if I do find some other colours. Now going into more familiar territory with that little watercolour set. I think this was the most talked about thing in the comments in my previous video. But what I did is actually prize all of the colours out because they were glued in, and I rearranged them into a much more logical order of colours. And I just did another small swatch in my sketchbook. I really wanted to paint on 100% cotton watercolour paper, so this is the Etcher sketchbook which has that. The teal colour was inspiring me the most, so I drew out this little picture of a mallard, those ones that have the lovely shiny green heads, and I thought the colours would work quite well for it. And I've got to say that this watercolour set is an absolute gem. It is so good. I paid $3 for it, and the colours are so vibrant. They dispersed well enough on the cotton paper, and most of them are pretty transparent. There are a couple in the set which are more opaque, but it is more of a white mixed in with the colour rather than it being chalkiness. A lot of cheaply made watercolours, when they dry, will actually become really chalky and horrible. These did not do that. They stayed vibrant, and I am so shocked by them. You could see on the duck there is a bit of a water dispersion going on. That's because I added too much water in that area, so that's more my fault than the paint's fault, and I went over that a bit later. So I'm not going to say that these paints by any means are going to rival professional paints. They don't. But for a little sketch set, they are pretty darn good, and I would recommend them to anyone if you just want to practice with something that doesn't cost too much but is actually of a decent quality. Then yeah, go for these. I'll have them linked in the description below. Hopefully they're still available. Sadly, I don't think the metallics are available at the moment. Hopefully they'll bring those back in, but I will link them if I do find them. I decided to use the metallics in this painting rather than doing one on black paper, just because I was running out of time, and I thought it might be nice to layer them on top of the watercolors to see how they'd go. Not bad. I'll show you them a bit later once everything has dried. I had a little bit of space left on this page, so I'm drawing in another bird. This is a crimson rosella, which is native to Australia, and we get loads of these around our house. They are such beautiful birds, one of my absolute favourite parrots. We had 2 in our yard just yesterday eating the seeds that we put out for them. And they are incredibly vibrant red. The colours in this set are not exactly the same as the bird's plumage, but I wasn't too bothered by that. It's close enough. I just mixed in orange and red to get slightly different shades and make it look more interesting. I found mixing the grey and the brown together was a really good combination for a nice neutral background. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about surfaces. When it comes to spending money on art supplies, I would highly recommend investing your money in a really high quality paper. So if you can get 100% cotton paper, it is going to work so much better than cheaper paper, which is really frustrating to use. You can get away with cheaper paints as long as the surface you're painting on is good. That's what I've found. And brushes, you can get quite a lot of cheaper ones in the Taklon range which work pretty well these days. I think the general quality of cheaper brushes has improved compared to what it used to be. Like, you used to have to get the really expensive brushes to get anything good. But the one I'm using in this painting is cheap to mid-range level brush, and it worked perfectly well, so no issues there. I need to revisit the KMart watercolour paper, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't very good. I'd recommend investing in a more expensive art paper. But the paints are great, and here's my finished page. Well, both the watercolours and the shimmery ones have worked very well. Let's see if I can get some sheen going here. And you can see it all along here and also a little bit around these areas where I added it. It's not too bad. And these colours are all very nice. I didn't really use the pink. Pretty much all of the others I used at some point in these little paintings. So another excellent little supply for a $3 set that could very well be disposable if you needed it to be. It's excellent. And now moving on to my last thing with the woodless coloured pencils. I wanted to take a break from drawing, so I'm using the pencils to colour in the July page on my Joanna Basford calendar. I kind of forgot to do May and June, oops, but here was a good opportunity to get July's one done. I also tend to view these pencils as more of a colouring thing rather than for drawing, and so that's what I thought I would do. So the pencils themselves, I'm of 2 minds with these. I like that they're woodless. They sharpened amazingly well in my electric sharpener, and I was able to get a really fine point on them. So they are a harder lead, and I noticed it when I was colouring that they're a little more difficult to use. They remind me a bit of the Derwent Pro colours in that respect, where they tend to struggle a bit on smoother paper like this. They also feel really waxy, and so I do think they have a lot of binder in them and perhaps not quite as much pigment as, say, professional pencils. But these are not meant to be professional pencils. I paid $5 for them. I mean, what can you expect, really? I found that they actually got better after I'd used them a bit and sharpened them a few times, like it had taken off this waxy layer on the top of the pencil, and then they did start to get a little more vibrant. The warmer colours especially were really nice. They also layered surprisingly well on top of each other if I coloured them quite lightly and then slowly built the colour up, so they were pretty good in the end. They're never going to be my favourite pencils by any means, but they're decent enough, And if you're on a real budget or are a beginner, I think these pencils are perfectly fine. They work nicely, they're not too frustrating. Frustration factor is always a really important thing to consider. If an art supply just brings me that level of annoyance or frustration, then I consider it to be not a good one, and that doesn't matter how much it costs. I've gotten frustrated with really expensive items as well, but these things gave me maybe a moderate level of frustration, so after a while I got over that and I was okay with them. I'd give these probably a solid 7 out of 10. They're not the best supplies that I use today, but they're not also that bad either. I'm just more of a coloured pencil snob, and once you've used things like Caran d'Ache Luminance and Derwent Lightfast, it's really hard to go back to cheap pencils. But overall, I'm really happy with how this picture turned out. I was able to get a decent amount of colour out of it, maybe not as vibrant as I would have normally liked, but pretty close nonetheless. Well, that's me done, and I managed to achieve quite a lot of art out of these really cheap supplies, and I enjoyed everything. I thought all of the supplies from Kmart that I have tried have been very good, if not excellent, and I don't really have any complaints. So if you're in Australia and you're curious about some of the supplies from Kmart, I highly recommend giving a few of them a go for yourself, because most of them are only a few dollars each, and they have proven themselves to be quite highly pigmented. They are not annoying to work with, which is a big thing, that frustration factor. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope this was helpful just to see the art supplies in action rather than just a few swatches, and let me know in the comments what you think of them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and click the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and I will see you all again really soon in my next video. I hope you're having a great day out there. Take care, swatch you later, bye.